So let me get this straight, Makoto said, jabbing her chopsticks at him. Endeavor is an abusive piece of crap, and you don't want to expose him and get his butt thrown in jail? That would hurt more than it helps, Izuku said seriously. Endeavor is the #2 hero. People may not like him, but they trust him to fight the fights that they can't. But aren't heroes supposed to be people to look up to? She demanded. Shouldn't they have morals? Ideally, yes. But if you look back at any civilization, I can tell you with almost certainty that their heroes weren't great people. They're narcissistic. They usually don't care about other people, or at least not as much as we think they should, and they're selfish. People don't necessarily care if a hero is motivated by people in distress or the desire to be the top hero. The only thing that separates them from the villain is perspective, Izuku said, their words tinged with weariness. But does it really matter why the hero is fighting those fights if lives are saved? Does it change the fact that those civilians get to live another day? Blinking at the boy, Makoto asked, Hold up, where did this jaded child come from? Are you the same Midoriya Izuku I met this morning? I want to believe in morally straight heroes just as much as anyone, Izuku defended. But I also need to be realistic about it. Heroes are human too. They have emotions, they make mistakes. Expecting them to be anything else is unhealthy for them and us. That doesn't mean we shouldn't expect more from them, but idolizing them the way we do is setting society up for failure one way or another. If everything good in this world is supposed to come from heroes, what happens when they don't measure up? Makoto opened and closed her mouth a few times, her mind clearly racing. Dang, kid. Do you take philosophy classes in your spare time? I've just thought about this a lot over the past year, Izuku said. It kills me to know that Endeavor, and probably other heroes as well, are getting away with things like this. I don't want to condone it, but if we do things right, Endeavor will pay in another way. I see where you're coming from now, and as much as I hate it, I think this might be the right way to go. Unfortunately, Endeavor is smart. If he weren't, I'd be a lot more useful. Manipulating stupidly vain heroes is my specialty after dealing with Captain Celebrity for so long. The serious conversation dropped off immediately as Izuku's eyes comically widened. Almost reverently he breathed, You worked with Captain Celebrity? Yes, and he was the most vain, pig-headed man I've ever met, Makoto said disdainfully. Tell me everything. I will, Makoto said with a wicked grin, if you tell me about this Uraraka girl that Saito has told me so much about. Izuku visibly shrank into himself. So, I think the first step in investigating Endeavor will be. No, you don't get to dodge the question. Is she or is she not the Uraraka Ochako that is on my list of students to interview? She is, Izuku said slowly, painfully. So a hero student then? You're certainly ambitious, Makoto said, wiggling her eyebrows. Looking for someone with a nice paycheck? If she's good enough, then. No. Izuku said, scandalized. I would like her regardless of her wanting to be a hero. She's kind, and smart, and pretty. It took a moment for his words to sink in, but when Izuku realized what he'd said, he flushed bright red, sinking into himself. That's so pure, Makoto said, smirking. What's your plan of attack for the pretty, smart, kind Uraraka? Send her flowers? A necklace, perhaps? I asked her to get boba tea with me tonight after my shift. You move fast. I'm impressed, Midoriya. I was afraid you would end up chronically single like my dear brother. But eat quickly, we're going shopping. What? Do you think we need disguises to gather information? Izuku asked before shoveling rice into his face. No, we've got all week to gather evidence. We only have a few hours to get you date ready. I'm assuming that the rest of your closet looks somewhat similar to this, which is unacceptable. Luckily Saito and Sasaki have their lunch breaks soon, so they can help us find something more appropriate, she said, fingers flying across the screen of her phone. Izuku paled. No, they can't know about. Too late, Makoto sang, grinning as she triumphantly held up her phone. The text has been sent. I bet you that one of them will reply within the next 5 minutes. This is a nightmare, Izuku groaned. At least until we hear from one of them, can we focus on the real problem at hand? I would argue that your outfit is a real problem, but I understand what you mean. So, to investigate our target, we're not going to want to stray too far into illegal territory. If he ever found out about this, Naomasa would kill us both. The problem is that our man is most likely good at hiding what needs to be hidden. Also, we need irrefutable evidence or we're going to have a rather rough future ahead of us. We have probably until Friday until Naomasa starts to get suspicious, so. Makoto cut off as the sound of sirens approached. A wicked grin spread over her face as Izuku felt his soul depart from his body. When the flashing lights were visible and his worst fears were confirmed, Izuku abruptly stood up, desperately searching for alternative escape routes. I need to use the restroom. The few other inhabitants of the restaurant looked worried and a little suspicious of him. He hadn't made it far when the door opened and a familiar voice sang, "Oh little Midoriya." Panicked, Izuku ducked into the first place he found, but before he could make it very far down the hallway and find an exit, he was forcibly pinned to the wall with a pair of handcuffs slapped onto his wrists. A small part of his mind wondered if this was how criminals felt when they were arrested, embarrassed, terrified, uncertain. Mostly, though, Izuku was impressed at the speed Saito was able to cuff his squirming form. The station had competitions, but she may have just broken her own record. What seemed like moments later found Izuku in a mall dressing room while three women pushed more clothing under the curtain. He estimated that he was wearing the 17th outfit they had forced him to try on, and they weren't going to like it. As per usual, he couldn't manage to tie his tie correctly, so it looked particularly atrocious with the ghastly polo shirt with lime green polka dots. Even he knew it was a rather unfortunate ensemble, one that Saito immediately vetoed. "We're just going to get boba, is a tie really necessary?" Izuku complained. Makoto stared at him with an intensity that was frankly terrifying. She squinted at him before turning around abruptly, disappearing among the clothing racks. Saito and Sasaki glanced knowingly at each other with smug smiles that made Izuku even more nervous. After a few minutes, Makoto emerged triumphant, lobbing a bundle of clothes at his head. "Leave the button up undone over the t-shirt." Rubbing at the indent of a button on his forehead, Izuku drew the curtain, happy to get out of the terrible outfit. He was even more excited when he saw the t-shirt Makoto had thrown, a new, extremely soft shirt that featured edgeshot across it. Izuku eagerly pulled the shirt on, and the coordinating button down on top of it. That paired with tighter jeans than he usually wore along with his red shoes made him feel confident. A little more put together as well. Before he opened the curtain, Izuku even found himself running his fingers through his hair in an effort to make it even a bit less wild. When he pulled the curtain open, Saito whistled lowly. "I will pay for that myself, little Midoriya. Both shirts are actually the right size, and they still fit your personality." That's the one. They made him wear it out of the store after Saito paid for it all, though it was an impressive fight to see who would pay. They also held the Save My Fanny Pack hostage, claiming that it ruined his whole look. Izuku felt slightly naked without it, but he couldn't change their minds without making himself late. By the time they left, it was almost time for his meeting with Uraraka, so Saito and Sasaki swung by the station so he could clock out before they dropped him off in front of UA's gates. His heart was pounding in his chest, but Izuku only had to venture a few feet onto the campus before he spotted her pacing around the courtyard. He waved, and both of their faces were abnormally red as they approached one another. "Why, you look really nice," he stammered. "Thanks, so do you," Uraraka said, hands fiddling with the bottom of her shirt. They stood there for a few extended moments, valiantly not making eye contact until Uraraka said, "Should we get going?" Oh yeah, we can head over there now. I hope walking is okay," Izuku said, the words a bit rushed. He'd memorized the route to the cafe last night thanks to the help of the internet, so Izuku walked confidently. Once he asked how training for the ultimate moves was going, the tension melted away, allowing them to settle into a comfortable conversation. A part of him felt like he was being watched, but Izuku couldn't pinpoint anyone suspicious. He was probably just nervous. Ordering and paying for the boba was an easy process. The trick was getting it to where Uraraka was sitting without tripping or spilling anything. When he finally made it over to her, his hands were shaking slightly from anxiety. "Here you go." "Thanks," she said with a strained smile. In sync they took a sip, and when it stayed silent between them they took another. And another. Then, at the same time, they began. "Midoriya, I have to." "Uraraka, I have something." They both cut off with a laugh and said at the exact same time, "Sorry, you go first." Awkwardly adjusting his shirt sleeve, Izuku said, "Really, you go first." "Oh, Midoriya, I like you," Uraraka said, face pink as she wasn't quite able to meet his eyes. "I think you're really interesting, and I'm flattered that you asked me on this date. I'm in the hero course, and I need to focus on that right now." "I'm so sorry. I didn't want to hurt your feelings, but I also didn't want to lead you on." Uraraka was clearly plagued with panic and regret, but Izuku wildly shook his head. "No, not at all. I actually wanted to say something similar. I need to focus on becoming a detective before I think about anything like a relationship, and I'm being sent on a long-term undercover mission soon, so I wouldn't be able to see you or talk to you, which wouldn't be fair, and I probably shouldn't have told you that for legal reasons," but Detective Tsukauchi said. He trailed off, forcibly stopping himself. "Sorry about the muttering, I got the habit under control a while ago. It only seems to be a problem when I'm around you. Not that that's a bad thing. I'll shut up now." The girl across from him searched his face intently. "Do you really mean it? We're both young, romance can come later. But the sooner I become a detective, the more people I'll be able to help. I've got a goal, and I won't give up on it," he said, clenching his fist and feeling vaguely like an anime protagonist. "I've been given an opportunity I can't pass up." "That's exactly how I feel about UA," she confessed with a smile. "Can we still be friends, though?" Izuku asked hesitantly. "Like, I'll text you when I'm not undercover and stuff, and when we've both reached our goals we can, see what happens." He awkwardly gestured between the two of them, blushing profusely. "Sure." Uraraka squeaked, her face equally red. "It will be like a competition, who will reach their goal first?" "You're on," Izuku said with a grin. The conversation fell into a comfortable patter once again until it was time for Uraraka to get back to the school. He was almost sad to drop her off at the gates, but they swore to make plans together again soon. Izuku's mind was full as he found his way down the street. Things had gone far better with Uraraka than he could have ever hoped, and he could dedicate all of his energy to saving Todoroki. Everything was. What was that? No, please, don't let it be. Seriously, little Midoriya? After all the effort we put in? Saito demanded, storming down the street. Izuku turned to face the three approaching women, making sure to move backwards to keep some distance between them. "We both have dreams," this made the most sense. "You couldn't divide your attention for her?" Sasaki asked, wings fluttering angrily. "You just friend-zone her and walk away?" "It was mutual," he said, surreptitiously glancing around for some escape route. "And were you three spying on me? Don't you have jobs to do?" Makoto shrugged, but it was clearly the wrong thing to say. The look in the officer's eyes could only mean bad things, so Izuku turned on his heel and sprinted away from the women as fast as his body allowed. The whole while Saito and Sasaki yelled their justifications for the invasion of his privacy, and something about him and Uraraka having cute babies together. Excerpts from Izuku's analysis. Name: All Might, civilian name unknown. Age: unknown. Height: 220 centimeters, 7 feet 2. Occupation: hero. Physical description: redacted. Personality: redacted. Quirk: redacted. Notes: for both security and personal reasons, this entry has been largely removed. Chapter 27. Izuku's hands gripped the binder tightly as he waited in Nezu's office with Makoto next to him. Nerves twisted IH's stomach in knots. This would end well, it had to. When the door opened, he was sure he was going to have a heart attack right then and there. Nezu strolled in with a cold Todoroki in tow. It hurt Izuku to see the guarded look back in his eyes, but when the boy saw Izuku, the look flickered from wariness to confusion. Midoriya? What are you doing here? If you'll all follow me, there's a private conference room that may be a more appropriate setting for this discussion, Nezu said pleasantly. The group wordlessly followed, staying silent until the principal left. So what's going on, Midoriya? Who's this? This is Tsukauchi Makoto, she's a friend, Izuku said quickly. I brought you here because you don't deserve to suffer anymore, Todoroki. And I have a way out for you. A way out? His voice was flat, like he couldn't bring himself to consider, to hope. Do you know what emancipation is? Basically, you are able to be your own guardian, make your own decisions. If you were emancipated, you would get to choose how involved your father is in your life. UA offers scholarships for exemplary students, and you would be able to live in the dorms. We're already having an officer monitor the treatment of your mother, and your older siblings are adults and they have the means to protect themselves, Izuku said. Nerves were eating at him as the heterochromatic boy just stared at Izuku. He'd kept some semblance of calm until this point, but the words seemed to catch on one another when he said, and if you needed or wanted, you could come live with me and my mom. We have extra rooms. He couldn't help but shift uncomfortably in his chair as Todoroki just stared at him, face frozen in an emotionless mask. He didn't know what more to say, but Makoto stepped in. This is a lot to deal with all at once, isn't it? She spoke more gently than Izuku had ever heard, eyes less intense than usual. If you'd like, we'll explain the whole procedure to you, and answer any questions you might have. This is going to go whatever way you decide. If you want us to, we'll destroy this evidence and pretend today never happened. Todoroki intently listened to every word that they spoke, hints of emotions flickering through his eyes. Once they finished explaining, he stared at the table for a few tense moments before raising his eyes to stare down Izuku. You're sure this will work? Not 100%, but I really believe it's the best chance we've got. You deserve to be free, Todoroki. He stared at Izuku with those mismatched eyes just a moment longer before saying, I'm trusting you, Midoriya. If we go down together. Hearing this, Izuku smiled impossibly brightly. No, you mean we're on our way to a healthier, happier life. I didn't know how messed up my life was until I escaped it, so now it's your turn. Makoto narrowed her eyes. The longer she spent around little Midoriya, the more questions she had. Someone had hurt him, and one day she would get answers one way or another. Heaven help the fool that hurt that child, but that was if the knowledge was revealed to Naomasa and the rest of the station. Makoto was going to find out, and she was going to subtly and systematically destroy whatever public persona those people possessed. Once she was finished with Endeavor, naturally. At that very moment, Nezu popped into the room. Endeavor is on his way over to discuss his son's schooling. Up to this point he didn't allow young Todoroki to live in the dorms, so I insinuated that I wished to discuss the issue with him in person. Prepare yourselves. I thought you only told Makoto, Todoroki said, somewhere between panicking and accusing. I did. I just asked Nezu if I could see you, and he was the one that did all of this. I actually wasn't sure how I was going to contact Endeavor. I was maybe going to visit his agency tomorrow, Izuku said, holding his hands up. No matter what I do, there are some things that Nezu just knows. And I am more unsettled than ever, Makoto said brightly. Midoriya, please never get on the principal's bad side. Naomasa would be devastated if you disappeared one day. They heard the man before they saw him, footsteps heavy with the sense of importance that came with being a top hero. He appeared in the doorway in all of his blazing glory. As a child, Izuku would have been thrilled beyond words, but now he thought that the hero's whole appearance was harsh and overdone. Endeavor searched the room, his face twisting into an expression of annoyance when he noticed Izuku. What are you doing here, child? He had to steel himself, but Izuku met the man's gaze, refusing to waver. I'm here to intervene on behalf of your son. Moments earlier, Endeavor's eyes had dismissed Todoroki, but now his eyes narrowed at his son. Shoto, explain this nonsense. Todoroki straightened, face impassive despite the panic that simmered under the surface. Before he could say anything, though, Makoto interjected, I would recommend you sit down, Endeavor. And I would assume that Principal Nezu wouldn't approve of his conference room being set ablaze, so I suggest you extinguish yourself. I'll just be in the other room now, Nezu said, merrily closing the door behind him. What is this? Endeavor demanded, eyes scanning the room. If you want to stand while we discuss things, that's fine, Makoto shrugged before sliding the binder across the table to Endeavor. We so lovingly compiled this just for you. Rolling his eyes, the hero begrudgingly sat down, flipping through the first few pages before he leveled a glare at Izuku. Where did you get this? That's not important, and don't bother burning it. We have plenty more copies if we need them. You can keep looking through it or not, but rest assured that everything in there is something that you wouldn't want the public to know. If anything happens to anyone in this room that feels like a threat, we have people who will release whatever they feel is appropriate, Izuku said with more confidence than he felt. The man's flames went out, though the room felt at least 10 degrees hotter from the intensity of the man's glare. What do you want? We're so glad you asked, Makoto said with the grin of the cat that caught the canary. We've got some very important documents ready that will emancipate your son. You will have no rights or responsibility towards him. Any interactions with him, any financial support will be Shoto's terms. The same goes with your older children, and people will be checking in regularly to ensure that your wife is receiving the care that she needs. Endeavor continued skimming through the binder, his jaw clenching more and more tightly with each page. Izuku wouldn't say that he looked defeated, necessarily, but he had accepted the inevitability of the situation. Accepting the paperwork from Makoto, he asked stonily, and how am I supposed to explain this to the public? You decided your son deserved the opportunity to make his own way in the world of heroics. He needed to step outside of your shadow, Izuku said coldly. Hopefully in the meantime you'll gain an actual sense of morality. Endeavor signed the paperwork with enough force to shatter the pen before rising from the table. When you decide to come crawling back, Shoto, there will be hell to pay for this insolence. He won't need to come back, Izuku said stubbornly. You may have had accomplices, but this whole situation stinks of you, quirkless child. One day reality will catch up with you, and you will learn your place in society. An insignificant insect to be crushed underfoot. Makoto blinked. That would sound a lot more threatening if you weren't currently being blackmailed by a so-called insect. As if on cue, Nezu appeared to usher out the growling Endeavor. Thank you for coming on such short notice, Mr. Todoroki. We need this room soon, so if you'd kindly be on your way. Endeavor left, led by Nezu as Todoroki stared straight ahead, eyes unseeing. I don't have to go home again. But, I don't have a home. That's not true, Todoroki. Maybe one of your siblings will invite you to live with them, but as long as you want it there's a spare room at my house waiting for you, Izuku said earnestly. You could even come over for dinner tonight if you wanted. He nodded numbly and allowed Izuku to lead the way. It was just in time, too, because Izuku had the sudden, visceral need to flee. He had just confronted the number 2 hero, directly putting his life in the line of fire, and he was acutely aware that the number 1 hero was due any minute now for his interview with Makoto. In true Nezu fashion, the principal didn't allow Izuku to talk to him, he merely waved the boy on, saying, I'll make a note of young Todoroki's whereabouts to his teachers. Nodding thanks, Izuku hurried out of the school, leftover tension spurring him on more quickly. Eventually, though, he was able to slow down, much to Todoroki's relief. And like at the training camp, both boys found it easier to talk than usually. They spoke about everything and nothing at the same time, each unwilling or simply unable to address the real issues at hand. But this also came with the comfort of knowing that there was time. There was time to worry about what did happen, what didn't happen, or what might happen. And in this moment, there was time to not worry about anything at all. Todoroki wasn't sure what to expect from this whole situation, but in his wildest dreams he couldn't have expected this. He didn't know what it meant to come to a warm house with freshly made cold soba and a teary mother figure waiting for him. He felt awkward and the conversation was stinted, especially whenever Mrs. Midoriya began crying. But at the end of it all, the Midoriyas showed him the bedroom that was his. It was smaller than he was used to and filled with second-hand items, which Izuku and Inko repeatedly apologized for, promising that they could replace anything and everything with things he picked himself. An alien warmth filled his chest, and Todoroki found himself saying, "Don't worry, it's perfect." Meanwhile, however, Shinso Hitoshi sat in his bedroom, idly flipping through a binder. "This is some spicy stuff," he said to the absurdly fluffy cat lounging across his bed. "I kind of want Endeavor to mess up so I can watch him crash and burn." Excerpts from Izuku's analysis. Name: Bakugo Katsuki, Kachan. Age: 16. Height: 172 centimeters, 5 feet 8. Occupation: hero student. Physical description: Kachan has spiky blonde hair and red eyes. He's fairly muscular, though not as bulky as some. Personality: Kachan has a personality almost as explosive as his quirk. The rest has been redacted for his personal safety. Quirk: explosion, or explosive sweat. Kachan sweats something similar to nitroglycerin, and he can detonate that sweat via his hands. It seems he can only activate explosions through his hands. His explosion leaves behind a sweet smell, almost like burnt sugar. Notes: redacted. Chapter 28. Izuku and Todoroki, Shoto, now just Shoto, talked and texted as much as they could, but Todoroki had school, and police work was only getting more demanding by the day. They were finding an odd friendship that neither knew quite what to do with, but each would defend it, and the other person, with their life. But Izuku couldn't rest easy, there was too much hanging over his head. They had gotten all of Endeavor's paperwork filed and taken care of. With a few calls to the right people, it was processed and Shoto was officially free. Now Izuku was able to direct his worry to the mountain of other things he frequently concerned himself with. Knowing that he was potentially going undercover, Izuku threw his whole being into his efforts. His analyses were better than ever. He spent longer training than ever before, gaining a proficiency with the katana that was frankly shocking. There was this mysterious drive to get better, to do better. It was like he could feel someone calling out to him in desperation. That said, Izuku had fully expected the call when the time came, but he still found himself surprised and terrified when it was staring him in the face. He was called into Detective Tsukauchi's office unexpectedly one day, and he immediately knew what was going on. "Have a seat, Midoriya, you're going to be here for a while," Tsuramage said in his trademark calm manner. "It's nice to see you again, Chief," Izuku said faintly. "What can I do for you today?" "We have a rough quest for you, Midoriya," he said, making steady eye contact. "Before we go into detail, rest assured that you are not required to say yes to this. Personally, I didn't want to ask you this, but here we are. Detective Tsukauchi has been working with the case, so he'll explain the issue." The detective was sitting rigidly in his chair, discomfort radiating off of him. "It has been decided," he said woodenly, "that you would make a good candidate to go undercover on one of our most dangerous ongoing investigations. The subject at hand is the Shady Hassaikai, one of the most prolific branches of the Yakuza. We don't know very much about them or their motives, but this man is their leader, a man named Overhaul." Izuku felt a chill run down his spine as he looked at the photo of a man with piercing golden eyes and a plague mask. "If you accept the role, you will be integrated into the Shady Hassaikai to learn as much as you can about them and their plans for the future. This is incredibly dangerous. If you are found out, you will almost definitely die." He couldn't look away from the photograph. Something about the man felt oppressively sinister, but it also solidified his resolve somehow. Izuku could tell from the look in Detective Tsukauchi's eyes that he was urging Izuku to decline the proposition, say no and continue on like normal. But he couldn't. Meeting Tsuramage's eyes, he unflinchingly said, "I accept. I'll do it." Don't feel rushed into it, Midoriya, Tsukauchi said a bit desperately. You're not being pressured to go. I know, detective, Izuku said. But I don't think I can live with myself if I decide not to go. Perfect, Midoriya, Tsuragame said with a sage nod. Preparations will begin tomorrow. Tsukauchi rose from his chair. I'll see you out, Chief. Midoriya, you stay here. I need a word. Izuku nodded, swallowing heavily. This conversation wasn't going to be a pleasant one. He could hear Tsukauchi escort the chief away, but it was the sound of the detective coming back that Izuku dreaded. It came too soon, and the detective's face was almost terrifyingly blank. Naomasa stared down Izuku, eyes searching. He felt like his very soul was being examined before the detective said, I understand I won't be able to change your mind, Midoriya. No, sir. You will go by the books on this one, the detective said vehemently. You won't overstep your bounds or make rash decisions, and if you've harmed yourself, intentionally or accidentally, I will put you on meter maid duty for months. Understood, detective, Izuku said seriously. Inko cried when Izuku told her the news that night, and he found himself inundated with people doing what they could to prepare him. Valiant called every contact he knew that had anything to do with sword fighting to help train Izuku. Dr. Meiji took him through analysis drills, making him assess quirks more accurately with less and less time. The fanny pack was seriously scrutinized. The officers completely took it apart, deciding what could stay, what should be added, and so on. Some of them, Saito, took it upon themselves to periodically ambush Izuku to prepare him for anything. Izuku was given every scrap of information on Overhaul that the police possessed, though he suspected that there was something the heroes weren't sharing. He just couldn't bring himself to wholly trust Sir Night-Eye, no matter what he did. When the stain incident had happened, his name had been released, but his connection with the police had not. With the media's focus on heroes, he had already largely been forgotten. It would be fairly simple to build an underground persona for himself. It sounded perfectly believable that a quirkless teenager would turn villain, almost more believable than one joining the police force. They needed a disguise for him that he could maintain for an indeterminate amount of time. It came in handy that he was so plain looking for once. If they could just give him a few temporary distinguishing characteristics, he would largely be invisible. First came a haircut, which Saito and Sasaki argued over for hours. Saito wanted a mohawk, Sasaki wanted a buzz cut, and Izuku decided that he officially no longer trusted either of them. Eventually the three of them compromised on an undercut. Saito happily pointed out that the top was long enough to wear in a man bun if he wanted to, and it left Izuku wondering why she had been on the committee for choosing his clothes to take Uraraka out. On the bright side, the hairdresser was very kind, showing him how to style his hair with pomade so it didn't hang in his face. When it was all done, Izuku was a little unsettled. He looked older. His face didn't feel so round anymore, and with his hair up it highlighted the recent scar that ran through his eyebrow. A new wardrobe was called for. Izuku jokingly suggested they find some t-shirts that simply said, villain, but it was swiftly and mercilessly shot down. He was also denied his jeans, cargo shorts, and worst of all, his red shoes. They're your trademark shoes. If anything is going to get you recognized, those would, Nakamura said, ripping the high tops out of his hands. Go change. Let's see how these clothes work. Izuku hesitantly took the pile of clothes into the bathroom, slowly taking off his uniform. The jeans he was given were clearly skinny jeans, along with a tight, plain black t-shirt and a dark teal zip-up hoodie trimmed in black. Last came on a pair of heavy combat boots and a teal medical mask, the same shade as the hoodie. He took a moment to look in the mirror. The mask was large enough that it even covered his freckles. In these clothes, he looked dangerous. Saito whistled when he stepped out. You look like I should be arresting you right now. Just 2 last touches, Nakamura said critically. He handed Izuku the fanny pack. I recommend wearing this across your torso instead of around your waist like a dad on vacation. It will also make things more accessible to you, should you need it. And for the second, Here he procured none other than Hero Killer Stain's sword. You need to decide if you want to wear it at your waist or on your back like Stain did. We had it sharpened, so the blade isn't as notched and beat up as when you saw it last. Interestingly, it seems to have been made with a quirk that reinforces metal, so if you get enough strength behind your swing, it can literally cut through steel. Izuku took the blade reverently before strapping it on various ways, trying to see what was most comfortable. I think I'll keep it at my waist. Stain was quite a bit taller than I am, but it makes more sense for me to start a fight with an upswing. Along with the training, Izuku was repeatedly drilled on how to act with his new persona, what kind of person Deku was. It was honestly the worst part of the whole process. He'd survived this far through belligerent optimism, by telling himself there was always a chance. As Deku, he forsook society, and let society forsake him. It should have felt foreign to Izuku, but it was familiar, too familiar. That night at dinner, Izuku couldn't bring himself to eat very much. He found himself pushing food around his plate and not meeting his mother's eyes. You leave tomorrow, don't you? Inko asked, already combating tears. Yeah, he said, trying not to cry himself. He was failing. I know I can't stop you. I'm proud of you, Izuku, but I'm also just so scared. So come home to me, okay? I'll wait as long as it takes. He finally found the strength to meet his mother's eyes. I will, I promise. I'll do everything I can to keep myself and anyone else that needs it safe. Can you tell Shoto when you see him next? He's got those provisional licensing exams coming up, and I don't want to distract him when he can't really do anything about this whole situation. Inko stared at him for a few moments before sobbing even harder. I'll tell him, but remember that you have a lot of people waiting for you. We're all cheering you on. The next morning didn't feel quite real to Izuku. He hadn't gotten very much sleep that night, and before he left the house, his mother hugged him tightly, refusing to let go for a long while. When she did let go, Izuku gave her a shaky smile. I'll be back before you know it. His walk to the police station felt a bit like a death march. Walking into the station, however, felt like a zoo. Upon entering, he was immediately seized by Saito, who shook him vigorously by his shirt. Don't you dare do anything stupid, she hissed, her face concerningly close to Izuku's. If you stab yourself with that stupid sword again, or get seriously injured by one of those criminals, I swear we're putting you in a protective bubble. Saito, put Midoriya down before you give him a concussion, Detective Tsukauchi said sharply. But her threats stand, Midoriya. I don't want to be visiting you in the hospital at the end of all this. Izuku ducked his head. I know you all have your doubts, but thank you for supporting me anyway. His head snapped up when a strong hand settled on his shoulder. Soma was looking at him with sad eyes. We're letting you go because we know you can do this, Midoriya. We just want you to be safe, but you're willing to sacrifice some of that for others. In the end, it's all part of the job, but we worry about you because we care. Thank you, Izuku said, crying once again. Mori snorted. Get it out now, kid. You're not going to successfully infiltrate anything if you can't hold it together. After all the goodbyes were said, Izuku was given a refresher on the most important information before he was sent to the bathroom to change. He felt teary and jittery through it all, but something in him stopped when he touched the sword. When practicing with it before, he had been able to avoid thinking about it, but this sword had tasted blood, including his own. It was a blade that had tasted death. Heroes, good men had fallen to this blade, all because of their broken society, a society that had broken him in turn. He couldn't totally dismiss Stain's ideals. It was a twisted world they lived in. Izuku's hand tightened on the handle of the sword. He could use it to change society, similar to what Stain had done. But where Stain had cut down, Izuku swore to protect. What Stain tried to destroy, Izuku resolved to reform. Slipping on the mask only solidified his resolve. Izuku, no, Deku, stepped out of the bathroom without a tear in sight. Even those that had been part of selecting Izuku's disguise were shaken at how different he looked, this muscular boy with eyes as sharp as his sword. Detective Tsukauchi clapped him on the shoulder. If you're going to do this, do it right. When the time comes to confront the Shi Hassaikai, we'll be there. In the meantime, kick some gangster butt. Saito cheered. Izuku smiled, briefly giving them a glimpse of the boy they knew and loved. I'll be waiting to see you all again. The station watched with bated breath as Midoriya Izuku turned and walked away. Sasaki's fist tightened, nails digging into the palm of her hand. He's going to be okay, right? Naomasa smiled sadly. Of course he is. He hasn't reached his goal yet. It will take a lot more than a few rogue gangsters to stop Izuku. Excerpts from Izuku's analysis. Name: Ojiro Mashirao, Tailman. Age: 16. Height: 169 centimeters, 5 feet 6. Occupation: hero student. Physical description: Ojiro has blonde hair, both on his head and on the tip of his tail. His tail is rather long and thick, and other than the tail, Ojiro is considered plain-looking, like me. Personality: Ojiro is a quiet individual, but friendly and kind towards everyone. He is a hard worker, with a strong sense of dignity and maturity. Quirk: Tail, with its extremely creative name, is just what it sounds like. Ojiro's tail is extremely strong and flexible, and Ojiro uses it as comfortably as another limb while fighting. Be careful of the tail, it really packs a punch. Notes: I consider Ojiro one of my best friends. He was the first person my own age I really got to know after Mom and I moved, and he gave me hope for the rising generation of heroes. Chapter 29. The main compound of the Shi Hassaikai was simultaneously everything and nothing he expected. It was in a less reputable part of town, but the compound was quiet, organized, and clean. If it weren't for the sinister undercurrent surrounding the place, Izuku would have doubted that he was in the right place. An unassuming man came out, eyes Izuku critically. Can I help you? Offer directions, maybe? Izuku did everything he could to keep his face blank, even though the majority of it was covered by the medical mask. I'm here to see Overhaul. Overhaul? The man smiled nervously, his eyes flicking to the front door. I think you're mistaken, we don't. Enough, Izuku. No, Deku said flatly. If I have to fight, I'll fight, but I will be speaking to Overhaul today. Tension permeated the air as Izuku and the man stared down one another. He didn't let his focus waver, even when he had to draw his sword to slice away the encroaching vines. So the man could control plants, Izuku had had his suspicions. He smiled, and it wasn't a kind smile. The man couldn't see it, but he definitely picked up on the dangerous glimmer in Izuku's eyes. So I am in the right place, perfect. The man panicked, raising his arms as he redoubled his efforts, causing vines to converge on Izuku, trapping him on all sides. It should have been impressive and intimidating, but it only took a few sword strokes to eliminate the threat completely. I expected more, Izuku said. I hope Overhaul isn't as disappointing, or I'll have to change my plans. Oh, I'm just beginning, the man snarled. Izuku could have easily taken the man out then and there, but it was more convenient to wait for the man to raise the alarm and then knock him out. Less people came than Izuku was expected, which really worked in his favor. He didn't want to have to use more than the sword in this initial altercation. His mind and sword were whirling, picking apart quirks and weaknesses, taking a good portion of the men down with a single hit from the flat of his blade. There were only 3 or so men, but it felt a little too easy. He hesitantly sheathed his blade, keeping one hand on the handle just in case. Deku hung back from the doorway, sure that they weren't done yet. Sure enough, a hulking figure appeared. It was obvious that he was of a higher caliber than the other men, and a part of Izuku was secretly thrilled to have a challenge. Just looking at the man, Izuku would guess that he had a quirk dealing with crystals, probably fairly hard ones. You're in the wrong place if you just want to pick a fight, kid. They attacked first, Deku said easily, sheathing his sword as a sign of goodwill. I just want to talk to Overhaul. And don't try to tell me that I'm in the wrong place, you saw how that went over earlier. The man looked him over critically. And what would you want with Overhaul? I hear he's doing something big, something that will give meaning to even my useless life, Deku said, inwardly recoiling at how right the words tasted on his lips. The man's eyes widened just a bit. Well, first you have to prove that you can be useful. Before the man had even stopped speaking, he rushed Deku, wickedly sharp crystals protruding from his forearm. The crystals clanged harshly on the metal of the sword, leaving a deep gouge in the crystals. Izuku couldn't help but mentally thank whoever had made this sword. A certain light came into the man's eyes as he rushed Deku again, this time a crystalline sword extending from his arm. The man was no amateur, that was for sure. He pattered the crystals so they were much more durable, they didn't shatter on impact. He was good, Izuku readily admitted that. He fought with the ferocity and reckless abandon that came with having nothing to lose. Izuku found himself curious about the man's abilities, so he made little mistakes just to see how he would respond. They were fairly evenly matched, so it cost Izuku a jagged gash across his upper arm. When he decided the fight had gone on for long enough, Izuku pulled back and swung his katana with all his strength, aiming at the same gouge he had made earlier. The force had made tiny fractures all along that area of the crystal, and now hitting it again, the entire structure shattered. Izuku had sheathed his sword by the time the man had recovered, brushing away tiny shards of crystal. Like I said, I'm not here for a fight, I just want to talk to Overhaul. I'll admit, you've piqued my interest, a voice said from the doorway. Izuku had to hide the shudder that ran down his spine at the sight of Chisaki Kai in the flesh. The way his golden eyes glittered combined with the black beak mask made Izuku feel like he was cornered prey. Follow me. Their footsteps echoed in the sterile, empty halls. The interior was traditional Japanese decor, but it felt too perfect, almost as if it weren't meant to be lived in. Unsurprisingly, the room Chisaki led him to was equally spotless. There were 2 couches in the room, facing one another. Wordlessly the other man pulled off his glove, touching Izuku's arm. An intense pain radiated from Izuku's arm. In the heat of the moment he had barely even noticed the wound, but now he felt like his skin was attempting to tear itself apart. His jaw clenched so tightly that Izuku was honestly surprised that he hadn't cracked a tooth or something. But just as soon as it had started, the pain was gone as soon as Chisaki withdrew his hand. Underneath, Izuku's arm was perfect. There was no blood or scar that remained. A show of goodwill, Chisaki explained. I would recommend disinfecting that blade when you get the chance. Now tell me, what made you seek me out? Just seeing the photograph, Izuku had immediately had a visceral reaction to Chisaki. A part of him had wondered how anyone followed the man, but now he understood. The man was subtle and sinister, but with how the man acted towards Izuku, a part of him wanted to belong. Why does anyone come to you? I've been called useless my whole life and I want to prove everyone wrong. I want to find a use in your hands and watch the world burn, Deku said, the words too ready, too true. The weight of those golden eyes on him was almost too much to bear. Tell me your story. I don't have a story, he said flatly. I'm just a Deku, someone thrown away. Whoever I was before is dead. The Hassaikai needs people like you if we're going to finish what we've started. That was an impressive display of sword fighting out there, Deku. Is that your quirk? It took everything in him not to freeze up at the question, a force of habit after years of torment. Didn't you know? Dekus don't have quirks. Izuku felt like his heart was hammering in his chest. This was it, the moment of truth. Sir Night-Eye had been so sure that Chisaki would be impressed with Izuku because he didn't have a quirk, but more and more Izuku was thinking that putting his life into Sir Night-Eye's hands was a terrible idea. He didn't know how the Hassaikai saw quirkless people, but there were plenty of people out there that readily engaged in quirkless hate crimes. Why didn't he listen to Tsukauchi? Chisaki's eyes widened, his eyes taking on an interest that made Izuku a little uncomfortable. You were right to seek us out, Deku. Together we can eradicate the disease that plagues this world and make it a place for the cleansed. He managed to keep his face impassive, but inside Izuku was reeling. Did Overhaul just act like being quirkless was a good thing? If he made it out of here alive, Izuku was going to set Saito loose on Sir Night-Eye. He knew nothing. They didn't know the goals, motives, or even the people of the Shady Hassaikai. Why did Overhaul seem excited over a quirkless teenager? What was this creepy, cleansing nonsense? Pushing those emotions away, Izuku nodded once, which seemed to satisfy the other man because he waved his hand at the doorway. Chrono, take Deku and his sword to be cleansed and show him to a room in the main compound. Are you sure? This boy has proven his strength, but not his loyalty, Chronostasis said. Izuku didn't dare look back at him, but he had seen pictures of the masked man in the thin file that Sir Night-Eye had supplied. He will stay in the main compound, Overhaul repeated with a slight edge to his voice. Put him in a room near the center. Yes, Overhaul. Follow me, boy, Chronostasis said, footsteps already echoing down the hall. It took everything in Izuku's power not to scramble to his feet, instead standing up and bowing slightly to Overhaul with measured moments. He then caught up to Chronostasis not by running, but by lengthening his stride, all body language he'd had to perfect to become Deku. He had to act older and more composed than he was, all part of the efforts to be accepted into the Shady Hassaikai. As you heard, I am Chronostasis, Overhaul's right-hand man. You will not partake in any part of our operations until you are explicitly permitted to. This is your room, you will sanitize your sword as has been requested by Overhaul. One of the Expendables will be sent to you shortly to show you where you've gotten clearance to go. Chronostasis gestured to the doorway Izuku assumed was his new bedroom before walking swiftly away. He paused in front of the room. Logically it made sense, they were human too, but he'd never pictured Yakuza members having bedrooms. Somewhere in here, Chisaki could be in a room of his own, likely bathing in disinfectant. He couldn't help but think of his own bedroom, and even his bedroom at the university in Hosu City. Like the rest of the compound, it was a traditional Japanese room, spotlessly clean. As instructed, Izuku took the time to hunt down some disinfectant wipes and clean his sword. Aside from that, there wasn't a ton to do. Izuku doubted that anyone else would be as welcoming to him as Chisaki had been. He knew Chronostasis was only allowing him to stay because Chisaki wished it. It was doubtful that the others would demonstrate the same level of loyalty or restraint. He'd already dealt with the crystal quirk user, but based on what little information Sir Night-Eye had supplied, he would likely be the most sympathetic to Izuku. The few people he knew about were intimidating to say the least. He could do nothing but trust his training in the new toys the other officers had gotten him. Try as he might, he just couldn't repress the wave of irritation at Sir Night-Eye. He wouldn't change his decision, he knew that being here undercover would change a lot of people's lives for the better. No, a part of him couldn't help but feel expendable to the hero, almost as if Sir Night-Eye was simply gauging Izuku's abilities. It seemed like whoever was coming to show Izuku around wasn't in any particular hurry, but he didn't dare take off his sword or fanny pack. He wondered if it would be one of the few he had files on that picked him up. He had gotten lucky so far, but while he had trained in analysis for months, he preferred not to start from scratch in a life or death situation. Izuku had decided to meditate while he was waiting, and this was how his escorts found him when they knocked and opened the door. Not one, but two people stood in the doorway, both wearing Overhaul's trademark plague masks. The smaller was no one Izuku knew about, but the larger was the last person Izuku wanted it to be, Rappa Kendo. Rappa was a former MMA fighter who found his pleasure in life through fighting to the death, and he was almost certainly going to ask Izuku to fight. So you're the new recruit, the unknown man said, eyeing Izuku up and down. He's smaller than I imagined, Rappa said, disappointed. I'm probably not going to get a very good fight out of him. Making a show of standing and adjusting his sword, he merely dipped his head down and said, Deku, as way of introduction. Rappa bristled. What did you just call me? My name is Deku, he said, exaggeratedly rolling his eyes. If I show you to the training room, would you show me what kind of damage that sword can do? Rappa asked, intrigued. Oh, you wouldn't see it coming, Izuku promised. As he bantered with Rappa, he was doing his best to analyze the other man. I am Tengai Hekiji, the stranger interjected, and this is Rappa Kendo. We are here to show you which part of the compound you are permitted to be in for now. Well, are you going to stand around, or? Right, if you'll follow us, first we'll show you. The training room. Rappa interrupted, too eagerly. The dining hall, Tengai corrected forcefully. And if this does end in you two sparring, it will be through Deku's consent, and you will restrain yourself. He lowered his voice, mistakenly assuming that Izuku couldn't hear him. Overhaul likes this one for some reason. If you kill him, there will be consequences. I'm not getting any younger, Izuku said, inwardly wincing at how rude he was being. Am I going to see the compound sometime today, or should I find a spare futon for you too? Our apologies, Deku. If you'll follow us. The compound was fairly predictable. It was all spotlessly clean, and frankly a little boring. He saw the dining area. As it wasn't mealtime, the only occupant was a man rummaging through the fridge. In passing, Izuku felt a bit dizzy, but it faded quickly as he walked away. His mind spun with quirk possibilities as he was led through an entertainment room, the infirmary, and finally the training room. It came as no surprise when Rappa challenged Izuku the second they set foot into the room, but the other two looked surprised when Izuku accepted immediately and without hesitation. The other occupants of the room stopped what they were doing and stared at the newcomers, whispers flying around the room. Is that the kid Overhaul likes so much? Rappa is going to crush him. I almost want to feel bad for him. I bet you 5,000 yen that the kid's sword is going to break before he even touches Rappa. I'll give the kid the benefit of the doubt and say he'll get one good shot in. Placing a hand on the sword handle, Izuku stared Rappa down. The masks really were unsettling, but Izuku didn't let himself dwell on it for too long. He had to seem completely unaffected. His mind whirled with statistics and possibilities. Rappa was one of the few names that Sir Night-Eye had given Izuku, and he had done some digging. He may have given his laptop a virus, but he had found footage of some of Rappa's fights, so he was fairly certain of what the man was going to do. Show me what you've got, kid. Rappa bellowed, charging forward. Izuku made a show like he was going to unsheath his sword, but instead of that he merely dove out of Rappa's way at the last possible second. Rappa was an experienced fighter, and a single blow would be devastating to Izuku. Luckily Rappa was so massive he telegraphed his movements, they could be read from a mile away. He was also wickedly fast, but Izuku was faster, for now. He needed to end the fight quickly before he slipped up. Rappa was already charging at him again, this time from behind. Izuku tensed, listening intently before throwing himself into action, dancing around the other man, and away from his fists, with ease. He dodged a few more attacks like this, much to Rappa's fury. Finally the man stomped, demanding, "Fight me already." Oh, you want me to get serious? Izuku asked with a terrible glint in his eye. Very well. Changing his stance, Izuku made a show of grasping his sword handle with one hand, while the other came to rest on his chest, or more accurately, right near his fanny pack. While every occupant in the room focused on the sound of Izuku drawing his sword, no one even registered his other hand unzipping the fanny pack and snaking inside. Hit me with all you've got, kid. Rappa bellowed, charging forward. Just like before, Izuku merely sidestepped the man and his deadly fists. But he stepped around the arm and closer to Rappa, close enough that using his sword wasn't an option anymore. There was just enough time for the other man to say, "What are you?" before Izuku tased him in the throat. It shouldn't have worked, considering Rappa's size, and it wouldn't have with his old taser. But as an official part of the police force, he had been issued a taser with adjustable voltage, so it was effective against almost any opponent. As it was, he set it on the low end for Rappa's size so it didn't knock him out. It just stunned the man long enough for Izuku to step back and raise his blade to Rappa's throat. That wasn't a fight, it was just dirty tricks, one of the spectators muttered. I told you that you wouldn't see it coming, Izuku said, sheathing his sword. Acting bolder than he felt, he walked away without looking back, leaving his back exposed and his guides behind. He existed in a sort of limbo for the next few days. Some of the Hassaikai members were slowly taking a liking to him, but others were vehemently opposed to him. He heard the whispers around the compound, questions of his loyalty and true intentions. They were perfectly valid suspicions, especially as Izuku was a double agent, but that didn't make it hurt any less. The 8 Expendables were slowly taking their time testing him one by one. Rappa had been asking for a rematch for days, but Izuku had managed to deter him each time. He didn't know how much longer he would be able to put it off, but Tengai usually kept Rappa in line. Hojo also seemed to like Deku, but his relationship with the rest of them was tenuous at best. It was a natural reaction, especially to a quirkless person. It all led to one possible outcome, a test of loyalty. Chisaki was going to have to find some task or mission for Deku to prove himself. Knowing this didn't make it any easier to manage his nerves when Chronostasis stopped in his room, announcing that Overhaul expected his presence in an hour. He ended up spending his time meditating, fully immersing himself in Deku. When the time came, Hojo was waiting to lead him to the same room he had first talked with Overhaul in. Izuku had locked himself away, and he walked with even more confidence than before. The majority of the Expendables were waiting, including Namoto Shin, the one person he'd been avoiding at all costs. The man drew compulsory confessions and truths out of people, and Deku had come up with very few ways to counter the quirk. He had a few tricks up his sleeve against the likes of Tsukauchi and Makoto, but this was an entirely different bag of worms. His only defense was some method acting. As he had feared, Namoto was the first to speak. What is your name? Deku, he spat, against his will. And your quirk? I don't have one. Why did you come to the Hassaikai? This world is corrupt, and it needs to be fixed. A few people murmured to one another, but Chisaki's eyes got that certain gleam that worried Izuku deeply, or it would later, rather. And what is your quirk? I don't have one. Are you loyal to Overhaul? At this Deku clamped his mouth shut, suddenly feeling like his medical mask was suffocating him. But the words were stolen from him, leaving him feeling empty and violated. Not yet, but I want to know how he intends to cleanse the world. His fingernails sank deeply into the meat of his palms, hating this feeling. This was too much. He couldn't decide if it was Deku or Izuku that was genuinely intrigued by what Overhaul's cleansed world looked like. Would there be a place for him there? Well, there you are. He's already more loyal than some of you, Overhaul said with what Deku guessed was disdain. Deku, you're officially a member of the Hassaikai, and we have our first assignment for you. Anything, Overhaul. That look was definitely a dangerous one. If his mouth were visible, it would be curled up into a wicked smile when Overhaul said, I need you to establish contact with the League of Villains. Chapter 30. You want me to establish contact with the League of Villains? Deku asked, making sure not to allow any emotion into his voice. To what end? I want to talk with their leader to further the cause, Overhaul said. Is that going to be a problem? Not at all, Deku said easily, settling farther into the role. I must say, though, I'm a little disappointed. I've been here for almost a week, and you haven't even thought to ask what I can contribute to the cause other than my sword. I'm more than a pretty face, you know. His hands were steady when he pulled a small notebook out of his fanny pack, handing it to Overhaul. A part of him regretted it, but this would ultimately cement his place in the Hassaikai. It was filled from cover to cover with analysis of Overhaul and the 8 Expendables. A notebook that size meant that it was really a pitiable attempt at analysis, just the bare bones of what he was used to doing by now. It was just enough to further prove himself as a valuable asset. That's just a taste of what I can do. I'll have contact with the League of Villains within the week. Don't bother following me, it will end poorly for anyone who tries. Deku left the room without another word, knowing that he would be long gone before they were done paging through the notebook, let alone understanding the full ramifications of the analysis in there. He remembered exactly where the front door of the compound was, and his only barrier to exit was one of the underlings that he'd come across on that first day. It wasn't much a barrier, though, as Izuku only had to arch a single eyebrow to send the man scurrying away. The sunlight felt wonderful on Izuku's skin. He knew he could have left the compound at any time, but he'd stayed inside if for no other reason than to give them no reason to doubt him. He'd been feeling a bit stir-crazy cooped up in the compound. He could only train so much, and his analysis skills were already fairly exhausted. Checking his burner phone for the time, Izuku smiled a bit to himself. The timing was perfect. He just had to get rid of his tail, first. Mimic, or Irinaka Joy, probably thought he was being discreet. Izuku knew plenty about the man's quirk, like the fact that it would have been child's play for him to fuse himself into the bouncy ball that had been following him for at least a block, pretending to be an abandoned child's plaything. He played oblivious for another block until he spotted the perfect solution in a back alley. Deku plucked the bouncy ball off of the ground and hissed, "I warned you not to follow me." Then he threw the ball at the ground with all the force he could muster, watching in satisfaction as it arched into the dumpster, landing amongst half-rotted food. "Next time it won't be a warning," Izuku said harshly. "I get that you guys don't trust me, and I definitely don't trust you. I'll be back when I've made contact." It was highly unlikely that any of the Hassaikai would attempt following Izuku any further. If they could even find him, that is. He found himself smiling, genuinely smiling for the first time in days. His legs carried him across Musutafu, darting through alleyways and around buildings, finding himself at a rundown ramen shop. It was Tuesday, after all, and it was 12:30 on the dot. He slipped inside just as the only customer said, "I'll have a bowl of shoyu ramen." "Tonkatsu for me," Izuku said, drawing the attention of both the customer and waitress. The elderly woman's eyebrows furrowed. "I'll take your order in a moment if you'll wait to be seated." "No, he's with me," Detective Tsukauchi interrupted, a broad smile breaking across his face. "I just wasn't sure if he could make it today." Izuku took off the medical mask so the detective could see his matching grin. "You know the academy teaches us not to be predictable for safety purposes, right? Coming here every Tuesday kind of undermines that." It caught Izuku completely off guard when Tsukauchi stood, surging forward to wrap his arms around the boy. Stunned, Izuku just stood there limply, getting hugged until the detective backed off, looking Izuku over. "You're okay, right? No injuries?" "I'm fine. I haven't been hurt in the least," Izuku promised, and it was true if you didn't count when Hojo had slashed him. But it hadn't even scarred, it was gone before it had even become life-threatening, so it didn't count. Tsukauchi gripped his shoulder tightly. "You keep yourself safe, got it? I don't care how you justify it, you're my first priority. Keep yourself safe, if not for you or me, then for your mother." Lingering traces of his Deku persona were the only thing keeping his from crying all over the detective. "I promise I'll do everything I can to keep myself safe." "So why are you here?" "I trust you weren't followed." "To prove myself, Chisaki sent me on a mission," Izuku said, settling in further. He started in on his story, telling Tsukauchi everything that was important, passing him a notebook much like the one he'd left Overhaul. This one talked about each of the members, but unlike the other, it gave specific weaknesses and explicit details on which heroes would be most effective against each member, as well as some tactics for police officers to use on certain member of Hassaikai. He didn't want to leave the officers out of the fun. Izuku would pay to see Saito throat punch one of the 8 Expendables. They talked through their meal, and Izuku only paused when he got to this morning's events. He masked his hesitation to address it by shoveling a huge amount of ramen into his mouth, taking the time to chew it before he said, "Chisaki sent me to try to recruit new people to the cause." Tsukauchi stared Izuku down. He could sense that there was something Izuku wasn't telling him, but he also knew that trying to get an answer from the boy wouldn't be a very productive use of their limited time together. "Will you be safe?" "I'm in no danger from these people," Izuku promised. Tsukauchi was going to have to be content with that. The boy told the truth. Whoever these recruits were, he hoped that they would help Izuku if worse comes to worst. I trust you, Midoriya, Tsukauchi said heavily. Come back safely, kid. You got it, boss, Izuku said, saluting the detective with a grin. With that he replaced his mask and slipped out, disappearing onto the street. Sometimes Naomasa regretted letting Eraserhead train Midoriya in stealth techniques. Izuku knew his final destination, but he had a few errands to run first. A letter slipped under his house's front door, a gift card to Nakamura's favorite restaurant placed under the windshield wiper of his squad car since Izuku had missed his birthday, and a box of candies for Kimiko was dropped in the mail, all things Izuku did without issue or discovery. The most difficult task was going to be getting information for Sir Night-Eye. He had a few things he wanted to tell the man himself, but he didn't risk going into any hero agency while undercover, it would be asking for disaster. He loitered in the general area for a while, mostly killing time at that point. But after a while it appeared that Night-Eye wasn't in the area, and sadly Izuku didn't have access to Night-Eye's schedule like he did for the heroes he worked with regularly. Sir Night-Eye should have been the primary recipient of the information, as he was the one spearheading the whole debacle, but Izuku still couldn't bring himself to trust the man fully. He had also left the notebook with Tsukauchi to ensure that the police officers weren't going in blind. He scribbled down the pertinent information in yet another notebook, mostly details like what heroes not to include in the raid when the time came. His mind was sifting through various methods of delivery when he noticed he had his second tale of the day, one of Night-Eye's sidekicks, a UA student who went by Lemillion. Someone Night-Eye hadn't thought it was important to introduce Izuku to. For someone with a foresight quirk, Sir Night-Eye wasn't great at planning. It was clear that Lemillion thought he was a suspicious individual, and Izuku wasn't sure he could shake him off his tail. He wasn't Eraserhead, and Lemillion could walk through walls. A slight commotion arose a few blocks away. There was going to be a villain attack fairly soon. Lemillion stayed focused on him, a grin stretched across his face. It was clear exactly when Lemillion decided to make his move. Well, it was clear to Izuku, but it would have caught a number of people off guard. Hey there, you look a little lost. Can I help you? I'm fine. That's quite the sword you've got there, he finally said, lengthening his stride to match Izuku. You don't see that many swords in public. Listen, Lemillion, I'm a busy man. We can stand here and discuss my sword and the legality of it, or you can take the notebook I have for Sir Night-Eye and go deal with the things going on down the street. Your choice. How do you know, sir? And wah. A scream pierced the air, and Lemillion spun around to survey the situation. Make sure this gets to Sir Night-Eye, and only Sir Night-Eye, Izuku said, pressing the notebook into Lemillion's hand. And come at the villain down there from his left, he's partially blind in that eye. What? When Lemillion turned around again, Izuku was already gone. He probably could have found Izuku again if he had really wanted to, but there was a villain to see to. It seemed to Izuku that he had waited long enough to accomplish his purposes. The majority of them shall be there by now. He wasn't too far away from the League of Villains hideout, and there was a really good place to stop and get sushi from on his way there. This wasn't the same building that they'd brought him to when they'd kidnapped him all that time ago. That one had been compromised during that operation. It had taken a while, but they had found another bar to fit Shigaraki's aesthetic, and an old warehouse they usually saved for striking a deal. Thankfully this bar had better lighting, though when Izuku stepped inside most of the lights were off, and he was greeted by the familiar sound of Shigaraki yelling at whatever video game he happened to be playing at the time. Kurogiri sighed. Dabi, will you go inform Shigaraki Tamura that if he disintegrates another gaming system, he will not get a replacement? No thanks, I'd rather not deal with the tantrum, Dabi said lazily, not even looking up from his cell phone. Do you think Izuku is going to make it this week? Toga asked, idly sharpening her favorite knife. It was boring without him. Can't we just recruit him already? I already told you I won't be joining the league, Izuku said, finally alerting them to his presence. He really did enjoy his stealth training with Eraserhead. All eyes rested on him with varying degrees of shock. Toga was frozen, knife half raised while Shigaraki cursed, trying to hide the fact that he just disintegrated the gaming controller. Only Kurogiri maintained his composure, moving forward to accept the sushi platter he was carrying. It's nice to see you, Midoriya. I'm glad to see you are unharmed. There was some concern on your behalf when you failed to come to last week's poker night. That's actually part of why I'm here. I've got some business to discuss with you guys, Izuku said, unconsciously shifting from one foot to another. Shigaraki finished kicking the dust from the controller around so Kurogiri hopefully wouldn't see it before he sauntered over to where Izuku stood. You're sure dressed up, aren't you, Deku? The only way he could look better would be if he was covered in blood, Toga said with a dreamy sigh, her amber eyes fixated on him. It was unsettling, but mostly because of the knife that still gleamed in her hand. Ooh, is that Stainy's sword? It's mine now, Izuku said, unsure of where to start his whole explanation. But where were you last week, Midoriya? Mr. Compress asked curiously. Izuku took in a deep breath. I've been at Overhaul's compound. Before he could explain further, Shigaraki screeched, accidentally disintegrating a TV remote control. You refused to join us and join Overhaul instead? I thought we were friends, Izuku. Weren't you with the police or something? I am a police officer still. Izuku shouted over the panicking league. What? I'm undercover. I'm pretending to be a part of the Shady Hassaikai. I've been in the compound for the past week trying to gain Overhaul's trust so I can get more information for when the heroes decide to carry out the raid. Spinner let out a tense breath. I knew you would not stray so far from Stain's principles, Midoriya. Sword, Izuku said awkwardly. Anyway, Overhaul sent me here because he wants to discuss something with the League of Villains. I'm supposed to contact you within the week. Oh, he's deigning to speak to us? Shigaraki asked, a wicked smile spreading over his face. This has possibilities. He couldn't fully suppress his shudder at the thought of Shigaraki and Overhaul teaming up. The world wasn't ready for that. But I'm with Overhaul because the heroes are making their move soon. If all goes according to plan, the Shady Hassaikai will be dissolved. This sounds like we're dangerously close to breaking our agreement, Midoriya Izuku, Kurogiri said, studying him intently. Izuku sighed heavily. When he'd been invited to that first poker night a few weeks after the kidnapping, they had been forced to come to an agreement. Izuku and the League of Villains could keep up a tenuous relationship if they all promised to follow a series of rules. The foremost of those was that neither side was allowed to divulge any sensitive work secrets or ask about them. The League agreed to keep their actions out of Izuku's jurisdiction, and they wouldn't give away any information about what they were planning. Izuku wouldn't have been able to handle the guilt. Similarly, Izuku couldn't tell them police or hero plans or weaknesses. If he were ever in a position where he had to arrest one of them, supposedly there would be no hard feelings. He desperately hoped that after the kidnapping he would be forbidden to have anything to do with the League, and this wouldn't be an issue. He did value his friendship with the group of weirdos, they had sort of adopted him. They also gave him good intel on other criminal organizations, especially if they were annoyances to the League. Izuku largely justified it by claiming the League as a source of information. But no matter how many times he told himself it, he couldn't deny the fact that when the door opened and twice called, "Hey, Midoriya is back, we missed you. Go away, I can't win if you're here." Kit's corner. It had been a fairly big bust for them. It had taken weeks, but Saito had finally managed to bust this drug ring, finding the leader of it all making a deal in a local bakery. The terrified shopkeeper kept wringing his hands. I swear I had no idea this was going on. I just treated them like I did any other customer. We're aware, sir, Nakamura said as comfortingly as he was capable of. We will be by with more questions later, but for now just relax. If you have any questions or concerns, you can always call the station and ask for me or Officer Saito. Saito nodded firmly before her eyes landed on a cake, a very specific birthday cake that made her mouth and her eyes water. She cleared her throat. Although, We do want to take every precaution necessary to make sure that none of your baked goods have been tampered with. The shopkeeper paled while Nakamura's glare seared Saito's skin. Gesturing at the cake, she continued, we simply need to run a few tests. We need to run a few tests, just to make sure this wasn't laced with anything. Take it. The shopkeeper cried. Do you need anything else? This should be sufficient for our tests, Saito said, bowing to the man and seizing the cake, rushing out to the squad car before her partner could strangle her. When he made it out, Nakamura hissed, the criminal didn't even have any product on him. You can never be too sure, Nakamura. Now drive. The cake tortured her the rest of the way to the station, but when they finally arrived she carried it in triumphantly. I have the strawberry cake from that bakery on 5th. You can all thank me now. Murmurs of appreciation sounded across the station as they broke out plates and forks. It was the best local bakery, and the cakes were really too expensive to justify buying them when it wasn't a special occasion. Partway through the impromptu party, though, a sniffle sounded. Sasaki? Are you okay? Soma asked, patting his junior on the back. This is Midoriya's favorite kind of cake. The room quieted almost instantly as the officers slowed their cake consumption, contemplating the current state of their youngest comrade. Why's it so quiet in here? Hey, cake. Detective Tsukauchi smiled delightedly, serving himself a piece before looking around. What's up with all of you? We were simply worrying about Midoriya, sir, Kondo said, eyes softer than usual. He's not really one to avoid danger. Oh, I just got back from lunch with him. He's actually made it this far without getting injured, Tsukauchi said, feeling lighter than he had in weeks. Is this from that bakery on 5th? This is the best. The room was largely silent save for the angry stomps of Saito, followed by the clamor caused by her slapping Tsukauchi's cake out of his hands. What are you doing, Saito? You had lunch with Midoriya and you didn't tell us? She demanded, eyes blazing. We've been worried sick about him, and you couldn't even tell us to meet you for lunch? Yeah, we could have made Mori watch over the station during lunch. Sasaki spat. Hey.